For more on the highlights of Xi's speech, we're joined now by current affairs commentator Einar Tangen, live from Beijing. Einar, always great to see you. Chinese President Xi Jinping called on Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa, the BRICS, to reject the protectionism. What are some of the other highlights from his speech?
Well, I think the main takeaway here is that it was not only talking about the emerging nations of BRICS, but also the developing nations of Africa, and those can be echoed in other areas like South America, etc. What he's saying is that if we trade amongst ourselves, we can go forward. I mean, the days when you had to get your medicines from the West are now, India can supply them. If you needed machinery, China can supply them. So I think there's a lot of assurances being given here that there is another world economy that is not completely dependent on those who are trying to create a unilateral world.
So, Einar, is there strength in numbers here? I mean, pushing back against President Trump's message?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the telling set of numbers was that although these nations are only 40% of the world's GDP, they're 80% of the world's growth. This really highlights this kind of tension that is existing here between the developed nations, which are growing at very low rates, versus the rest of the world, which is growing very quickly. In order to make money, these first world nations are going to have to figure out how they can access these markets. And I think this is a big part of the push, the negotiation, which is going to be taking place between markets and money.
So last week, President Trump said he was ready to impose tariffs, as you know, on all goods imported from China worth $500 billion US. Mr. Ramaphosa pushed back, saying, "We're concerned about the rise in unilateral measures that are incompatible with the WTA rules and are worried about the impact of these measures, especially on developing countries." Two questions, Einar. What is the impact on these countries? And also, isn't the WTO outdated in some of its policies?
Well, let's start with the last question. The WTO is really feeling a lot of heat. If the United States, which helped to develop these rules and push for the WTO, actually walks away from it, the question is what happens? And it might not be the WTO itself, but it could be other trade organizations and blocs that kind of come forward. In terms of the developing nations in Africa and how this is hurting them, they're part of this global supply chain. And this idea that somehow you hit China and therefore that's the only part you hit is completely fallacious. What happens is every country that is supplying something to China or other nations is going to be hit directly or indirectly by this. You already went over the statistics about cars and steel in South Africa and how this goes. But it's really, as she put, it's a choice between going forward on a win-win situation or on a beggar thy neighbor type of situation.
So we saw President Trump today at the White House meeting with Juncker. He walked back on some of his threats. They seem to work something out. Do you think we're going to see a more conciliatory U.S. president in terms of working with BRICS nations and other nations?
Well, it's hard to say, but I mean, based on the past, what we've seen in North Korea with Russia, it's really hard to get to know what the specifics are. Saying that you are backing down from what appears to be taking a trade war to the entire world, including the EU, your traditional ally, I think he's under tremendous pressure from the business community. They are not impressed by this. They don't like the tariffs on China. They don't think this is the way to go about it. So I think he is walking it back, but we just don't know where he's going. There's no specifics. It's the usual, everything's going to work out great. They've exceeded. I expect to hear a lot of tweets about how he's backed down the EU and that this is how his administration is able to impose its will on the rest of the world. I don't know that this is really as conciliatory as it sounds. I think there's a large element of strategic patience on behalf of the EU as they try to figure out how to deal with Donald Trump.
Interesting. Well, Einar, let me also ask you, what should we look for coming out of the BRICS summits? Just a couple of things.
Well, I think you've seen part of it already. The trips by both Xi and Modi to African countries, putting out aid. I mean, for instance, Rwanda, a very small country, was in need, was going upside down with Donald Trump over this used clothes trade. They don't want used American clothes coming to the country. They want to develop their own industries. And the $300 million in total was promised to them in aid to help them develop their own economies. This is a very important thing, that the developing nations and the emerging nations are grouping together. They're not going to be marginalized at the table and just be told what to do. So things have changed dramatically, both in markets and in how people want to, how countries see this world developing. And it's not necessarily good for the United States, as it seems it's more isolated every day that it goes forward with these unilateral programs.